Hello and welcome to another episode of What Makes You Click with me, Daniel Mills. I'm Professor of Veterinary Behavioural Medicine at the University of Lincoln, and I'm very pleased to catch up today with a long-standing, I shouldn't say old, friend, Kendal Shepherd. Kendall will be known to many of you. She's a fellow Bristol graduate from Bristol Vet School, a few years before me, 1978.
Just a
Um,
few.
just a few. and so And Kendall is well known for not only her work in relation to dangerous dogs, and we'll no doubt catch up on that, and the welfare of seized dogs, but also for generating what's become, quite a well accepted thing, the ladder of aggression that is used to describe dogs' behaviour and calming signals. She also developed a teaching resource for secondary schools to try and help children understand sort of developing empathy and factors like that, using dogs as an example there. She's author of The Canine Commandments, this book illustrated by Victor Ambrose, and quite apart from the content, the illustrations themselves are well worth the book as well. Most recently, she has published Demystifying Dog Behaviour for the Veterinarian, that I have religiously read before doing this podcast. And we'll talk about that as well. She's also written a chapter in the Dog Bites book, the multidisciplinary perspective on the assessment of cases of dog bites, a UK legal perspective. And amongst her other components, she is a music composer and very talented with her partner. And yes, so a lady of many skills. And I was trying to think when I first met you, I don't know how I got to first meet you. And I'm wondering if it was through Roger Mugford, but I'm probably going to embarrass myself by thinking, oh no, that's not right.
Well, I do recall when it was, because I think it was actually Ian Dunbar who introduced us.
Ah, okay.
It was Ian Dunbar. I can't remember the exact chronology of it all, but I can remember when I first went to work for Roger Mugford. And I think it all sort of coincided around about the same time. It was around about the year 2000. But it was at an Ian Dunbar seminar that we met. And I met Connie as well, and she was pregnant for the first time.
Right, so that would be 1998 then.
Right, well, it's earlier than I was thinking.
Yeah.
So I met you before Roger Mugford specifically. And I also told you a very probably ill-advised joke, if you remember.
No,
Just
your memory
as
is a lot
leave it
better than
on.
mine. Are you able to share it on this
Well,
podcast or
well,
not?
well, yeah, well, I remember that as we walked away, because obviously I didn't know you then, and I thought, oh God, did I really say that to Danny? Anyway, it was because Connie was pregnant, and I asked you what the definition of amnesia was,
Ah, yes.
and it was the ability to have sex again after childbirth. So amnesia is a condition that allows a woman to have sex again after childbirth.
And
So
anybody who is a mother will understand that.
yeah. Well, it obviously didn't wreck our relationship straight away.
No, I have heard jokes around that versus being kicked in a sensitive area for males, and people argue that it's worse for males because women do have second children. And so they don't. But anyway, well, that's an introduction. Well, your memory is pretty good. And one thing I just want to say, in case people are not aware, probably about a year ago, more than a year ago now, you did have a stroke. So if Kendall pauses, words occasionally drop out, but you're looking really well. It's great to see you, and as I said, your memory is better than mine, so I don't know what my problem. I haven't got an excuse, but
No, it was a pretty it is a shock to the system, put it that way. But I am getting back to doing, all my normal things, and I've written a book since I had the stroke, so I was very pleased to get that done. And they've had lots of help. So
I remember Robin Walker meeting him after because he had a stroke, and it
yeah,
left him well. He as part of the stroke, he actually started to become paranoid, and he said
really,
it passed as he recovered from the stroke, but he said he was absolutely convinced that the nurses wanted to kill him in the
Really?
hospital, and he said, that detachment from reality is really scary because it is so real, that sort of situation. And but anyway, um, we're here to
We
talk
could talk,
about you.
we could talk for a long time about that. Yeah,
Um,
what's real and what's not, and what your perception is, and yeah, very strange.
but there is a link here, and it wasn't planned. Nothing ever is here. Um, but one of the areas that you have done a lot of work on is trying to get people to take the perspective of the dog,
Yeah,
and so, and I think you've really done a great job with that, and you're one of those people who really can communicate at lots of levels. And when I read the demystifying the dog book, the first bit of it, which is very much sort of about some of the stuff for helping people understand, the dog's perspective. Because you and I have been at conferences together, I could hear your voice in my head as I read this. I was thinking, I've heard this. This is so this is, you write like you speak, and you're very
yeah.
articulate, and that is a real skill, I think. Having that ability, and that's things like the ladder of aggression were just a fantastic way of communicating. So I guess have you always been such a great communicator, or is it
Well,
something?
well, I don't know. I think looking back and speaking now to people I've worked with in practice before, particularly vet nurses, I did sort of, and this I mentioned it in the book actually. I did get a reputation of a sort of just being a very good vet is really just a good vet. And I think, and I suppose what that entailed as well, what I've come to realize is it is communication. It's not what you can do and how brilliant you are at doing some surgery, or it's actually communicating with your patient and with the person in charge of the patient. So I've often thought of it in the same way as one would look at pediatrics. You're actually having to communicate with the parents in order to get the treatment for the child or the baby sorted out. And you have to get people to agree with you. That's the thing. And the way I've sort of looked at it with dogs, you have to get the dog to agree with what you want. And it's as simple as that, really. That the dog has got to agree with you, because if not, there's going to be conflict. So we have to look at how do we get people to agree? How have I been good at getting people to agree with me? I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't really know how, as I said in the book, I get this reputation for being good with dogs. What does that entail? I've had this discussion, I remember, with Anne McBride once some years ago. And she said, and I said, it's just intuition. It's just something you just feel. And she said, oh, no, you're using all your knowledge and your science and all this. But I'm sure, and particularly with the ladder of aggression, I mean, I wasn't using science to create that. I was looking at what Torrid Rugas had done and what I could see in front of my eyes, and that's what I used. And when you first published that, when you decided it could go into the BSAV manual, I mean, I absolutely expected you to say this hasn't any scientific basis and it can't go in. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, it's one of those things, and it's that observation, and me as an academic scientist, some of the time at least, our job is science always starts with an observation, and it's that synthesis. Yeah. And yes, I do say to people, here is a useful framework, but. And I know we've discussed this in the past. Sometimes people slavishly follow the ladder and saying, "Oh, this should follow this," and I say it's not like that. It's more of a pathway, but the use of a ladder helps people, put things together.
Yes,
and I think that the danger of people becoming a bit too slavish to it, and the problems that can arise from that, are more than outweighed by the benefits and. That come from it.
Well, I think that's something that's been brought up. No, it's awful. I can't remember the chap. He was Dutch or Belgian. I can't remember who died, but he came up to me. He said, he first year, he really, I don't like this ladder of aggression. Oh gosh, what was his name?
Rudy de Meester.
Yes, it's
Rudy.
him. Yeah. And he came up and he said it ought to be a tree with branches. all over the place, you see. And of course, and then he came up to me a year or so later at a conference. He said, "Don't worry, it's exactly right as it is." So he'd obviously spent time thinking about it. And I know that some people are still saying that it should be titled differently, because it doesn't automatically mean that a dog that yawns at you or blinks or whatever it does is going to, go up to aggression. Of course, it doesn't mean that. But it's just the simplest way of getting people to actually see these signs.
Absolutely.
And I know from when I've used it in consultation, you say it to people, you say, when do you see your dog doing this specific thing? And particularly when we're discussing what guilt is, and how dogs can look guilty or not, they see it absolutely straight away, and can see if you don't understand this sign, then it is very likely that you are going to progress to the next sign. So I've stuck with the title and I've stuck with the rungs.
Yeah.
I have recently actually, I was reminded to have it's having to mention somebody who you might even have a chat with at some point, but Fox and Beckhoff, obviously, when I did the chapter, for which I had to look up enormous amounts of references, which I was not used to at all. But for the manual, I redrew their diagram and relabeled it, and so I credited them, and that was all fine. But so more recently, Mark Beckhoff, who I've had quite a lot of been in touch with and been to his conferences, and I was just wanting to get permission to use that again for this new book. And he said, "Oh no, you have to get in touch with Michael Fox." So I emailed him, and I sent him a copy of the Canine Commandments and all the references, ladder of aggression, the BSA manual. And he really went off on one through all his studies out of the pram, shall we say, about the lying down with the leg up. That he would not. He wanted me to take that off the ladder. I could not use anything unless I took that out of the ladder, because he wanted it called passive submission. That's what he's absolutely insistent it means. It means passive submission, and it means the dog is submitting to you. And anyway, we had to agree. Well, anyway, the sort of communication ceased, really, because obviously I can't change it as it is now, and I'd be prepared to argue that, what I'm seeing when I have a dog going on its back and lifting a leg up in the consulting room, you do not carry on fussing with that dog, because it is not submitting to you, and I'll argue that to my dying day.
Well, there is a study that has been published that looked at dogs rolling over, and and it interpreted it in terms of the rules, and rolling over being used as a tactic either to gain access to, in a interaction between two dogs.
Yeah,
a dog might roll over in order to gain access to a target on the other dog, or roll over to avoid access of the other dog to a part of its body as well. And then again, this is one of the things that I always come up against, and perhaps with your wonderful ability to simplify things, is just getting people away from the idea that a behavior means one thing. As you say, rolling on your back, fine in the context, but in the context of these other signs,
it's got to be in context. It's got to be in context. It's always an interaction, an interplay, and it's got to be in context. It's like saying, that when I frown, that's got to mean one particular thing only. It depends entirely on the social situation you're in, and you might look identical in very many different contexts for different reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just that understanding the complexity of it. We've got a limited behavioural repertoire, and so therefore you can use the same behaviour in different contexts and have completely different meanings. And and that's what people have got to appreciate, and rather than just sort of this means this, and go for it.
It's going to automatically lead to this. It's going to automatically lead to that. And that's why I haven't changed the title, because the whole The whole intention of it is to prevent aggression. It's to prevent dogs getting up there. They may branch off in all sorts of directions before they get there, depending on context, depending who they're interacting with. But the thing I wanted it to avoid is getting to the
Yeah.
top, and that context only. Yeah.
So basically, you know, taking a bite or a snap is a high risk decision. And, you know, from a biological point of view, you don't do risky things without trying everything else to avoid it, because ultimately, even if you win, if you get injured, and you know, the analogy I give the students is, you know, walking down the alley, I could bump into Mike Tyson, and, you know, we know who's going to win the fight, but I could still injure him if I put my knee into the groin. We seem to be talking about groins today. But, you know, so, you know, and that's always the risk. So you would expect there to be lots of signs or potential ways of communicating to avoid high risk strategies. One thing I can tell you is I've got a couple of students, unfortunately, one of them is on maternity leave at the moment, my current resident Himara, who is starting to tease out reports of the relationships between some of the signs from what owners can do. And Alex Capra from Italy kindly has lent us a load of videos, and we're currently analysing those in sequences as well to try and actually look at the probability relationships. But so we may have those data in due course. But it's, again, as I said, it's that conversion of things, quite complex ideas, into things that people can understand. And I mentioned that you did that curriculum for ASAB, and I don't know how widely it was taken up. I was chatting.
I mean, it was actually intended for. It could be sort of last year of primary through to secondary school. I think I was in contact with them a year or so ago to find out. I think they've had about 290 something uptakes of the resource, but not nearly as widely as one would like it to be. But I think there are different organisations doing lots of different things that are all great in the schools. And I know the ladder of aggression is part of what many other charities use who are going into schools. So I think it's really just, but then you see, you're dependent actually on the actual who is giving the lesson, the end, not just the end user, but the end deliverer.
For those that don't know the school resource, do you want to say a little bit about what it is, though, just so that people know? And as I said, you can still access it on the ASAB website, the Association for Study of Animal Behaviour. If you look under their educational resources, if anybody listening to this is a teacher and you're looking for something in personal social health, I think is the area that it was originally put through. I don't even know if they have that in the curriculum now.
Well, PSHE, I think it is. Yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit?
Well, it all started. I just decided to do a series of lessons in my children's own primary school. I mean, after they'd left, I didn't have a child at the school at the time. But I had used the school for puppy classes, so that you know, I had sort of communication with this particular school, and I did this series of 6 lessons. They were sort of an hour and a bit's length, and I had the whole of a year 10. It was the last year, and this is what the canine commandments actually grew out of the lessons. So because the way I did the lessons, I think I've got a list somewhere. I should have looked the list out. But the first thing I did was get the children to actually think, what would make you feel like these various things. So I showed kids pictures of spiders and snakes and fireworks and toys and, you know, pleasant things and things that typically, you know, make people frightened and what they feel themselves. And so right from the start, I got the kids to sort of empathize, and we went on to I got them to think about what senses we would use and what associations we can make via our senses to different things. So I got one table in the classroom, for example, they had to shut their eyes, so all the other tables could see what was going on, but the one table had to shut their eyes. And I got them, first of all, to smell TCP. And I asked them, what that reminded them of. What did it make them think of? And I used TCP, and I used coffee grains, and I used orange juice. And they said things like TCP reminded them of doctors, of hospitals, of, you know, injuries, that sort of thing. Coffee reminded them, one child piped up and said, that reminds me of breakfast. So I said, now that tells me straight away what your parents drink for breakfast. They don't drink tea, they drink coffee because it reminds you of breakfast. Then oranges, you know, reminded them of sunshine, of holidays, all this sort of thing. So so to begin with, I wasn't really talking about dogs, you know, saying this is what you've got to learn about dogs. I made them realize what they would feel themselves with these different sort of, you know, environmental inputs. And then we went on from there to sort of talk about how to, I think I did the warmer, colder game, you know, and got a child to go out and come back in, and we used sort of yes, no, they have to get warmer or colder or something. So it was to get them to the concept of, you know, how you could direct a dog to the behavior you wanted. You know, that if we just said no to them, they got to the target far slower than if you said yes, you're going the right way. This sort of introduced them to clicker training, I suppose, and though we didn't go into things as far as that. And I sent them home with various homeworks, like ask 3 people, a friend, a relative, how they'd stop a dog from jumping up. And, you know, I got the most marvelous homeworks back. You know, some I've actually saved, but it's just wonderful things, you know, and the final homeworks were what the children learned from the 6 lessons. And it really showed me how bright children can be, how accurate if you give them half a chance. You know, and they go home, and that's right, they go home and they say, no, you can't do it that way. You know, some child would ask their grandfather, oh, you have to knee the dog in the chest to stop it jumping up. You know, you've got the standard, you know, our old person's response. And the children would be going home and saying, no, you can't do it that way. And they would become, you know, their parents' teachers. So really, sorry, to cut a long story short, the ASAB resource is a sort of amalgam, a condensation of all those lessons. Yes, and one of the sort of the major outcomes was, in one of the lessons, I actually created a human ladder regression. So we got the kids to think, you know, what would make them go from being calm, having a bit of an argument, wanting to make peace, what you'd do, what you'd have to do if people carried on arguing. And, you know, the kids ended up with all sorts of gory details at the bottom, at the top, and they ended up with stabbings and hangings and all sorts of things. But again, so that is one of the essences that has been taken in and put into the teaching resource, is that there's a human ladder regression and you compare it with the dog ladder regression.
And it's also, as you say, it's about, you know, if they recognize those signs, they can also recognize there is conflict happening if they're with a dog and they start to feel those things, you know, you know, sort of, so it just creates that increased awareness. So I mean, we've talked about the ladder of aggression, and you mentioned in the book that it came about because of the BSAVA manual, and you decided to wing it in there. And as I said, it is a very sort of widely downloaded resource from lots of places that you've made it available. But you know, was there before you I asked you to write a chapter on aggressive behavior, and we were looking at trying to get away from the idea that aggression was dogs' ways of controlling the world, and that's what their motivation was. You must have been thinking about this long before, and you know, so that there must have been some driver behind it.
Yes, well, I suppose I started to become interested in behavior. So when I first met you, I was probably 2 years into just going to various different conferences and talks and listening to people and just thinking about things and what I was doing as a vet in surgery. And you know, I'd started to use the Halsey, for example, and, you know, I just started to think of things from the dog's point of view. And I suppose the, yeah, it kind of, when I left then general practice, I actually, that's right, that's reminded me. It's how I first met Roger Mugford, was I left general practice, and I took a job in a rescue centre as they were advertising for a vet, and it was a rescue centre in Milton Keynes, so it was a bit of a drive from me, and it was really extremely poor conditions. I mean, horrible, muddy. You know, it was just a pretty ropey old. The kennels were sort of old horse stables, and it was very, as I say, borderline really. But they were very, very open to behaviour work, and I remember that what is the Association of British Dogs and Cats Homes? They actually came round to Hula, as it's called, this rescue centre. And when they came round, they really didn't think much of the place. But what they saw, what I'd started to do, I'd started to put notices everywhere. Things like, have you asked a dog to sit today? You know, have you got treats in your pocket? Just notice everywhere to remind the staff. That the nurse I had working for me, a girl called Mel Daniels, she was absolutely marvelous, and she took on everything I was saying. She was a real help, and it was then when I was working there that I had somebody whose name escapes me, but it was a dog trainer working nearby who knew Roger and had heard that Roger had a vet working with him what happened to be Claire Corridon, if you remember.
Yeah.
So Claire Corridon had a job with Roger Mugford, but she'd had a car accident, and so he was looking for another vet to join to work for him. So I started to do 2 to 3 days a week working for him.
And Claire ended up as my PhD student in the meantime.
Yeah, I know all these connections. But I can't remember then how I then came to do behaviour counselling for you at Lincoln. When we
were short-staffed. I think we were desperately short-staffed.
You injured yourself, didn't you?
Oh, and yeah, I fell off a ladder. I fell off a ladder and broke my.
You fell off the ladder, yeah.
Broke my wrist. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So I came up and covered for you.
There we go. As I said, all these little coincidences. But so.
But that's really when that's when I actually developed the ladder regression. It was while I was literally, you know, twiddling my thumbs in the rescue centre when I wasn't actually busy doing something. I was just working on what I was seeing and what I was hearing, you know, from there. As I say, Turi Drugas was hugely influential. And it was just trying to put it in a simple way. So that's the way, that's chronologically how it all started off.
Okay. So I mean, I must admit, the book, your new book, Demystifying Dog Behaviour for the Veterinarian. There's I'll take my notes out, a little bit of notes in it for those people who are watching the video rather than listening to it. The book is full of really good stuff, but to me, the real and this sounds terrible, the highlight is the last sentence, I think, in the book. I love that anecdote, and I'm not going to tell people what it is so that people go off and buy it. It is just such a lovely.
So what it is now? Oh yes.
Yeah, it's you're at the epilogue, literally the last sentence or whatever. But you know, it's an interesting book because I said the first part, when I read it, I could literally hear you, because as I said, we've done conferences, and I was thinking, okay, I know where this has come from. You've written up your notes, and then the second part is really very much a manifesto for forensic clinical animal behavior, and that's, you know, that's very much where another area where you're a real pioneer. And you know, again, anybody who is interested in doing legal work, then definitely, this is a must read as well. But do you feel that the average vet in practice ought to be doing sort of that legal work as well? I mean, it is a fair chunk of the book, which is, and I think it's really important. And I learned a lot by reading it.
Well, I think the book is actually 3 sections, but so the middle section is what vets should be doing in practice, and then the last section is really how. I mean, I'm not advocating that the vets should become behaviourists. I mean, I've made that clear right through the book. The vets shouldn't be the behaviourists, but that should not absolve them from knowing a bit about behaviour, and they must be aware of how what they do in the surgery has a wider implications for society, both in what they do on the consulting room table, how that can actually spread out. I mean, people do, they copy what they see more than what they see rather than what they're told. They remember what they see. And I think that what vets in general practice may think it's not their responsibility, that that what they do there. I mean, it's been illustrated by the number of cases when I have gone back into the history of a dog who's allegedly been dangerously out of control, and I go back in the history. And I've got a case at the moment that I'm looking at where you can see from the veterinary history the dog's okay, fine at vaccination, fine at year-old vaccination, and then it then it gets a bit wary, then it gets a bit muzzled, has to be muzzled, and then suddenly it's, a year later it finds itself in court. Now, I'm not saying that vets caused the problem, but if they're not aware of the fact that what they're doing to the dog is exactly what dogs experience in real life, then they've got to realize that this could lead to, just because the dog is aggressive in this context, they can't say, well, it's nothing to do with me but they may have created the dog that is then wary in other situations. And if they deal with a dog in a certain way, and the owner of the dog or the carer of the dog deals with the dog in that particular ill-advised way, then this can, in time, contribute to a dog that has a reason to feel that it needs aggression, needs to use aggression for whatever reason.
I can remember one of the things, and I'm pretty certain it was you, that it was the first person who said to me, if an owner took their dog into the vet practice for a routine procedure and it came out with a broken leg, an owner would quite rightly want to sue the vet. But if it comes back psychologically broken, people just seem to accept it.
Yeah.
And I thought, and those words have sort of stuck with me. I hope they're yours, because a few years ago, actually, I was giving a talk in America, and I sort of said, I have to thank so-and-so for this video. And then I said, I have to thank Kathy Hout for this wonderful video. And Debbie Horvitz was chairing this. And she said, that's my video, not Kathy's. And I'm thinking, oh God, that's terrible.
I'm sure that is the point. That and of course, what we know now, from science studies, that a bad experience will be held in the memory. You can't kind of mitigate for a bad experience later. You can't sort of do a nasty thing to a dog, cause a dog pain, cause a dog fear, and then try and make friends afterwards. You've got to create what I see, this kind of bank of trust. You've got to create that first. The dog will then may forgive you for a multitude of sins later, but you have got to do it before you proceed to have a potential behavioural damage for a dog. So I think it is something vets have to take on board. And I mean, I think the problem now is with the pandemic, that vets are so overloaded now. That I don't know if behaviour is going to get kind of shunted away, and it's all going to be blamed on, it's a pandemic puppy, and I haven't got time to sort it out. But
I don't know. I wonder if sort of vets seeing dogs in car parks and then taking them into the surgery might be a lot better for a lot of dogs than being
Absolutely.
waiting in a
No,
waiting
no,
room. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Well, in fact, I wrote I mean, I think I've put no, I think Vet Times actually published it. I sort of expressed some thoughts on what owner absent examination. So it was
Mm.
owner, OAE, owner absent, and a lot of vets were really all in favour. The dogs are so much better behaved without the owners, and you know the owner was then seemed to be being blamed for the fact that the dog might misbehave. But you see, what a vet's responsibility should be is to teach the owner how to behave so that the owner's behavior does not impact negatively on the dog's behavior. So the vet ought to be able to say, look, don't just keep cuddling your dog, you know, let's just ignore him for a minute, let him calm down. So the vet should be helping the owners to help their dog.
Yeah, absolutely. And but also in fairness to owners, I think the time spent in a waiting room, the unfamiliarity of it, the animals passing by, you know, you're just building them up to a real sort of crescendo. And you know, and that's the other advantage is it's not just the owner absent, it is they've when you get them into the clinic, you're getting them in a much more relaxed state.
You're interrupting the sort of escalation of stuff before it becomes too extreme.
And certainly one of the things we found in our work that we've done interviews with the COVID is that one of the features that came through quite strongly is owners worry about healthcare during the pandemic and the ability to get good healthcare for their pets at that time. But hopefully we're on the road out of that. But you know, and I think we've all learned a lot through the pandemic as well as a positive practice, and maybe, you know, it'd be interesting to see if vets are reevaluating the way that they handle animals, etc.
I think they will. I mean, I think there'll be a lot more video consults. But I think hopefully they'll have had time to sort of reflect on what they're doing, because I mean, in no way was. I mean, I think Robin Hargrave in his when he sort of read the book, Robin Hargraves, he made the comment that he felt that some of it might have looked like as if I was vet bashing. I've certainly not intended that at all. That you know, I was blaming vets in any way for they haven't necessarily got time to think about behavior, and particularly in the way the behavior sometimes has been presented to vets in the past. You know, it's been presented as a sort of a thing, you've got to do all this study first, and you've got to, you know, and it's been made to feel something that you have to go into great depth before you can even think of giving a simple bit of advice.
And I think that's I think that's a really important point. And I don't think it was you, but you have said it, but I don't think you were the first one to say it to me, that one of the problems for veterinary behavior is it was a specialism before it was mainstream.
No, well, that was me. I'm sure it was me.
I'm not sure if you were first. I'm just not sure if you were first. And that's the only thing.
No, that's right.
And I will give a sneak preview. We're now doing a new edition of the BSAVA manual, and it is going to be very focused on the first line vet for exactly that reason, because most of the manuals at the moment, you know, they're so theory heavy and technical that actually we're going to have specific sections on, you know, this is what you can do in a 5-minute consultation type setting or 10-minute consultation versus this is what distinguishing what the specialist will do with the more complicated cases from what can happen in the first line, and you know what your average GP vet should be able to do. We're making a much clearer distinction in that, because I mean, I don't think there is a book that does that very clearly at the moment. And that's what we're hoping to do. So it's going to take a couple of years to produce the new edition with everything. And we still.
I mean, I think the fact is that when sort of behaviour became a field, and when Well, it was really David Appleby to begin with, the APVC. I mean, he tried to make the field have some gravitas, if you like, by emulating how a veterinary referral specialist would write a report, not to the owner, but to the vet who'd referred it. So that he made a great point that when he wrote these letters, you know, it was to the vet. It wasn't to the owner of the dog. It was to the vet. And you know, I sort of obviously changed that. I said, you know, the letter went straight to the owner, and it was for vets later to pick up on what I'd advised if they were interested enough to follow through. But it certainly wasn't, behavior couldn't be looked on as you know, you'd done an orthopedic referral, for example, or you'd looked at a dog's eye and said, I've done X, Y, and Z procedures. This is what the medication I've advised, and this is how the clients need to follow up. Because behavior couldn't be treated like that. It was the owners that lived with the dog day to day, and so therefore they had the letter, and the vets just had it as a secondary thing. But it was really because David, you know, he I think, you know, whatever sort of, you know, things one can say about some of the books he wrote to start with, that I can see why he tried to do that. That he because he was emulating the way veterinary, you know, and then behaviourists who followed on thought of it in that way, that you had to have all this academic stuff. We've got to pretend we know all this stuff, and we can't tamper with behaviour until we've got all the knowledge. The other thing that I must say now, I think that vets in general practice, and because there's so much corporate practice, there's hardly any, you can't find a vet-owned practice for love nor money now. That the vets are so afraid of best practice. They've all got to follow best practice. I mean, when I first was a vet, I used to do operations. I had the textbook in one hand, a really good nurse turning the pages, and I was doing the operation. Nowadays, I don't think anybody does that. They're too afraid. They can't because of best practice. So they think, oh, let's not do that because they haven't. Oh dear, no, we're not.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I started off with the PDSA, and referral was not an option, so you had to do everything. The one addition I would make, the vet nurse was not, when I started out, the vet nurse was not just turning the pages, she was telling me what I should be doing, because she knew what I should be doing. Yeah. This is how the other vets do it. This is what I suggest you do. And I suggest you don't put the scalpel there because the dog's going to bleed out.
You know, they were either your worst enemy or your best friend. If you didn't learn how to make vet nurses your best friends, you were doomed, I think. Yeah.
Oh yeah, they could make your life very, very hard. I've been very fortunate with the vet nurses, and I ended up marrying one. So yeah, and I think, you know, just to return to that point, and I think it is a really important point that you know, there is sort of, the professional vets were almost paralyzed by the sort of aura around behavior and the sort of and somewhere it got lost that doing nothing actually still has consequences, you know, and they're just hands off. I don't know anything about behavior, so you know, I won't do anything. And as you say, and you know, it comes through in your writing, whether it be in the book or anywhere, is that the basics of how to handle a consultation in a friendly behavior way, that should be every vet's bread and butter. And you know, you talk about vets slavishly following best practice. Well, that really should be there at the heart of it, that this is how you do a vaccination without traumatizing. And that's perhaps, you know, perhaps there's a real opportunity there to get into these corporate practices and say, you know what, you know, this is the way that you should be doing things. I'm not sure that any of them have taken it up, though. Are you?
Well, I think possibly the practice that's local to me has well, the one I used to work at and another one I've done locums for, they've both been taken over by corporates. One nurse has left in disgust because you can't cope with the things that are imposed on them, which, I mean, I think I did 1 week years ago for companion care, very early, you know, one of the first corporates. And, I simply refused to even, well, I was only there for a week, so it didn't really matter, but I could not be forced into doing blood tests on every single animal that came in for everything. I couldn't agree to put everything on a drip, for example, whatever was being done. And add a dental in. If it's something, you had to charge for it, scraping metatartar off, in addition to, everything. And I just simply could not sign up to that because it's just simply not necessary. I mean, what I've always thought is, this is nothing to do specifically with behavior, but I remember some talk I went to, and it was somebody who's, again, the name escapes me, he was talking about forks in the road. And his whole lecture was about forks in the road and how you sort of came to be where you are now and how you came to make the decisions that you made. And I talked to him afterwards about how, vets and the way I could see it was going. And I thought every vet should have a sort of, a section of their curriculum, which is you're on a desert island and you've got a thermometer, you've got one antibiotic, you've got one anesthetic, and you've got something you can kill things with. What do you do, and how would you approach it? Because it's sort of like third world. I mean, sort of, or war zone doctors, war zone vets. I think that maybe there's a sort of kind of paralysis that comes over vets if they don't have the equipment they've been used to getting, and they haven't got it all. And that's what, that's where the corporates obviously come into play, because they can afford to get all the kits and get everything, and so that vets are left sort of, as I say, a bit paralyzed if they really haven't got all the stuff.
But I mean, a couple of things my father, who was a vet, taught me, and he had an interesting career, but he actually started off as an anatomist, and he was a really good surgeon as a result.
Yeah.
But he always said, and he's no longer alive and probably turning in his grave at the thought of what goes on with the vet practices. But he always said, remember, the two most important diagnostic tools are your hands and your eyes. Probably add the third one of your ears as well. And I can remember seeing practice with him. He was doing a locum at a practice nearby, and this was a very good practice. They offered good standard of care, two good partners who offered good care, but they were a fair bit younger than him. And he was doing this locum, and I was there one evening, and he called in the client, and the owner stood up, and they took about 2 steps, and he turned to me and he said, "Remember this case," because he had diagnosed it from across the waiting room, and really? It was distemper. And this dog had been seen by at least one of the partners on several occasions for these runny eyes and whatever, and it literally had hard pad. So as soon as it walked on the floor, you could hear it. And he just, because he grew up in a time before vaccinations, his initial days, and distemper was a killer disease. But you saw it the whole time. And I, when I worked for the PDSA, I did see it as well. Likewise, we used to see parvo, but because this was a relatively affluent area and the vast majority of dogs were vaccinated, the partners had never seen a case of distemper.
Oh, no.
And it's just that sort of, it's that experience. But as I said, using the, your eyes and your hands and your ears, and the hands, he thought, particularly, he thought people were far too brutal as surgeons. They weren't respecting the tissues and things like that. And the other thing that he believed absolutely passionately about, and I think this is a danger of these sort of some of the corporate approaches, is that you are a professional. People are coming to you for professional judgment. If it could just be formulaic, then you don't need a human in that situation. No. And this is why when the teaching with the behavior that I do is, the students say, "Oh, well, how do you manage this case?" And so, well, every case is unique, and I individualize for that particular case. If you want a recipe card, please don't come and do our masters. That's not what we're here about. If it was that simple, you need to know yeah, what are the skills? It's like going back to the ladder of aggression. What are the components? And then you apply them individually rather than just slavishly follow a formula. And if you do it that way, interestingly, before the pandemic, I was in the States doing a weekend workshop, and one of the diplomats came along to it, and she said, I really enjoyed listening to your approach because I can get some joy back in seeing cases, because she'd got to the stage of, dog's got this fear, you use this drug, boom, and the thinking had gone out of it. Whereas the individualization, what we call the psychobiological approach, it doesn't mean that it's just, personal and, well, I'll do it anyhow. We've got a process that you follow, but you make professional judgments at each stage that you can justify. And and those are not just professional, but they're also scientifically justifiable.
Yeah, that's so important. And what I found in these legal cases is that certainly in the certain ones that when I look back in veterinary records, you've got to write down your stuff. If as some legal medical expert I heard went a seminar, a Royal Society of Medicine seminar, he said if it's not written down, if you don't write it down in court, it doesn't exist. And so what vets do, if they decide not to do a procedure, they've got to write down why they decided not to, and that's equally important as saying what you actually did do. It's just as important to say why you didn't. So I mean, it's an example that there was a case where a dog, obviously it was one. I think I mentioned in the book actually where there's this awful discrepancy for a dog that obviously needed. There's a huge discrepancy between what was offered in the smaller, in the general practice, and then what huge cost of what was quoted for referral, and the dog eventually died. But you couldn't work out from the vet's records why the vet had decided not to do certain things. They were missed out, but it wasn't written down. Now it may be that they never even suggested that it should be done, but it may be that they didn't write it down. And I think that's another thing vets could learn, that if there's any vague possibility that a case is going to become as a case in court, write down everything that you think and you do, and most importantly, and this is what I've discovered from doing locums, you maybe found the same thing, you don't necessarily need to know everything about the actual thought process of the vet that's been dealing with the case. I mean, although that is helpful, what you need to know is what the client has been told. If I can see from a vet record, can go into the consulting room knowing what the client has been told, you can pick up the case. You could have all the detail from the vet's point of view. I mean, I've just done a report on a post-mortem of a dog that actually died in police kennels of intestinal obstruction, would you believe? And the post-mortem report made no sense to anybody until I went in and actually interpreted the post-mortem results in terms of what would actually be able to be seen externally in the dog that was in the process of dying from this obstruction. So that you can be awfully technical in your vet notes and write all sorts of acronyms that nobody understands, including me. But you've got to write down. You've got to let everybody know what the client has been told, because it's down to communication. That's what we started talking about right at the start.
So let's talk about the forensic side of things. Obviously, I mean, you have become, I would say, the veterinary face of the Dangerous Dogs Act and the cases in the UK. And so how did you end up in that field? Was that through Roger Mugford? Because he was doing some stuff, and I know. I'm not sure if Roger said it on the podcast, but I did hear that. No, I think he did say on the podcast that some of his early advice actually was in favor of some of the legislation, and then he realized what a
Yeah.
a mistake it was, and that's why he did a lot of legal cases to try and,
Yeah.
I think, to turn
Well,
things around.
It was absolutely through Roger that I became involved in legal cases. It was after I started doing the consults for him, and I used to drive down and see 2 or 3 cases during the day, and it was because he was overloaded with Dangerous Dogs Act cases all the time. Now I started doing cases, not Section 1 of the Dangerous Dogs Act, which is the pit bull, the pit bull dogs, the prescribed breeds, the banned breeds. But I started just doing behaviours, so it was only on dogs that were said to be dangerously out of control. So and so that's what I started to do, and I've always seen it as an investigative process. So the whole process really is very akin to a diagnostic thing for sort of medical or surgical conditions. You are looking at all the possibilities of the causes. You're looking at the physiological results of that sort of injury or whatever it is, and you're trying to deal with that. And so that's what you do with the behavioural, with a legal case. You can't simply just go and see the dog. And I know that certain assessors have said they would need to know nothing about the history of the dog. They've got to just see the dog, and then they can kind of pronounce on it, because they can just see the dog in that little window of opportunity, that hour or so they spend with the dog. Now, I've never believed that to be the case. You have to get, in exactly the same way as you do a diagnostic process in a veterinary surgery, you have to take the history, you have to look at the context of the actual situation that led to happen. So you get all the witness statements, and then you provide a rationale for what the dog has done. And it's only then you take the assessment, the actual practical assessment of the dog, and layer that on top of all the other investigation that you've done, so that you look at it. So the assessment is really only, it's not a small part, it's a big part, obviously, of what you do. But you see, in any event, the assessment that you manage to do is entirely dependent, as we said, on context. And it's only as good as you can extract the information you're getting from the assessment and put it in the context of the situation as it occurred, and the history of the dog, and any medical condition that the dog may be suffering from. And you only then can create a prognosis. And that, of course, entirely depends on whose hands the dog ends up with in the future. And so it depends on how likely is the context in which the dog did whatever it's supposed to have done. How likely is that context going to be to occur again? And I will make suggestions as to how the context can be changed. What if behavioural interventions. But often it's as simple as shutting a garden gate,
Yeah. So just out of interest, because listening to what you just said there, I mean, how, for want of a better word, how suggestible, I'm going to use perhaps the wrong word, how suggestible are magistrates to somebody who just says, well, I looked at the dog and this is what happens? And, because it's very easy to speak with confidence when you know very little. That's always the problem for scientists, is that all the caveats, and therefore try like the with the COVID stuff, the anti-vaxxers or whatever, that you can sell. It's very easy to sell a lie if you've got a very simple message to sell. I mean, in a court, and I have done expert witness stuff. It tended to be horse stuff. Rather than this area, and that's always been interesting, because I make the distinction between equine behavior and equitation, because I'm usually up against somebody who is a horse riding specialist, and that's not what we're talking about. But so how easy, or how let's say suggestible are magistrates or the judges in those situations?
I was going to say how easily can they be bamboozled? I think that's.
I was going to say gullible, but okay.
No, well, I think that's the thing. I of course have no knowledge about how other experts, people who assess dogs, I have no knowledge of how they carry on, what they, the quality of what they do, other than in situations where they have been in opposition to me in the courtroom. They are working, you know, I'm generally instructed by the defense. I would love to do work for the prosecution, but that's never happened. But so that I can only say things about others when I've seen the reports they've done for the prosecution. Now, it's obviously to the prosecution's advantage, not to necessarily get all the history of the dog. Now, I'm not saying now this, I think, is why there is sometimes a question marks over people who are legal recognized as expert witnesses in the legal context and also do behavior counseling, because to my mind, if you're behavior counseling, you have got to get the history of the dog. You can't just as you have to get the history for any medical condition or surgical condition. So to me, the legal side of things, forensic veterinary behavior, if you like, has got to be looked at in the same way. It is a diagnostic process that has got to be looked at in the same way as any other routine investigation for any other condition. And I don't think that it should be looked at in any other way. It's not a separate.
I mean, I know the legal work that I've done, the cases I've been involved in, I've actually found it a really interesting process, because you're trying to stitch a story together from various accounts which sometimes conflict. And I actually, there was one case I was involved in, and there was some discrepancy as to when something happened, and it just so happened round about that time I'd watched an episode of Jonathan Creek, which is a TV program with
yes, I know,
and but for people maybe listening to this and aren't aware of it, and it's sort of, he was a magician who was also solved crimes, and in that episode there was a case where somebody, that the timing wasn't right, but what had happened was that the person had probably looked at their clock, their alarm clock, through a glass of water, and a 2 had turned into a 5. And we were in exactly the same situation in this case. And I thought, look, I think this is why this person thinks it happened on this time. And people are not, I mean, obviously some people do just tell porcupines, but generally, people are giving their account of their perception of what has happened at a time. And it's always that challenge. And I mean, I guess the main reason why I don't do legal work is it's just so time consuming, and I just can't do it at the moment. For that reason. But it is a real challenge, but you've got to be healthy in so much as you have got to go and get the diverse information rather than just try and sell one line. And I think that's, I've always thought, unfortunately the legal system doesn't go after the people who are most guilty. It goes after the people who are most easy to convict.
Easy to prosecute,
and that's and there's a big difference there, and therefore certain types of people, I think, are overly represented in the legal system, and that creates all sorts of impressions. So
I mean, remember sorry,
no keep
the very first, I mean, this is nothing to do with what I'm doing now, but it was when I'm many years ago, when the very first time I appeared in court was in fact it was a puppy dealer being prosecuted by trading standards for selling puppies that were not fit for purpose, because basically that is one of the the main reasons people can be prosecuted. The dogs are not fit for purpose because they're not fit for life, basically. Anyway, I was the only vet. There were several vets who'd been involved, but I was the only vet who'd actually sent this puppy away, or a portion of its gut away, for post-mortem, and the diagnosis had come back as parvovirus. Now, as it happened, I mean, the prosecutor was I mean, it's my first experience in court. I was quite young, but and I'd done loads of reading about parvovirus and told them exactly what the pathology was. and what the incubation period they were trying to make out. It could have been picked up a long time ago. It wasn't anything to do with this either. Anyway, the post-mortem of course kept saying, this indicates parvovirus, and I was being hammered by the prosecution by saying it only indicates parvovirus. That doesn't mean to say it is parvovirus, does it, Mr. Shepherd? Now, eventually, the actual bench, the chairman of the bench, interrupted and said, "Excuse me, Mr. whatever his name was, prosecutor, one of my colleagues is medically qualified and he understands absolutely what indicated means, and we are very happy with the fact that the dog had parvovirus." So you see, so that just indicates, that just sort of, I'm using the word indicates again.
Yeah.
But that shows that you are very much in the hands of the bench, and you are in the hands of what the prejudices of the bench, what perceptions they have of the case right from the start. It probably depends on whether their grandchildren have been bitten by a dog. You've no idea what's going on in their heads, but you can have a bench that says absolutely comes down on your side, and you can say, stop going on at her like this, stop, we are very happy with the answer she's given, stop it. Or you can have a bench saying, well, this person's obviously guilty, and so it's completely luck of the draw, really.
So I mean, one of the other areas that you've I think you've highlighted quite a lot is your concern over the welfare of seized dogs.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I mean, again, when do you want to say a little? I don't want to drag in sort of name names, but when did you start becoming aware that it wasn't just the injustice of the law, but equally what was happening to these dogs after they got seized?
Yeah. Well, initially, I mean, to start with, I wasn't aware. Obviously, you become more and more aware as time goes on. But in general, there are relatively few times that I've been allowed into the kennels where the dogs are housed, and this is for security reasons. This is because everybody's pretty paranoid about my disclosing where the kennels are, and maybe that somebody's going to organize. I've had it mentioned to me, a police officer who was very out of his comfort zone because I organised an assessment at Battersea Brands Hatch, which of course is outside the M25, and it was way outside his comfort zone. He thought, what if somebody organises a raid? And they're sort of paranoid about the owner of the dog. They're obviously nefarious people, so they're going to organise some gangland raid to rescue the animal. So you can understand why there's security, and the people who work in the kennels are sworn to secrecy, and everybody, so that there's very few opportunities to actually get into the kennels and see how long. But you simply know for a fact that dogs are kept in social isolation. They're kept, so that even if two dogs are seized from a family, and that the two dogs will be separated and they'll be in social isolation. So, and you also know, which of course has become much worse since the pandemic, that the time dogs spend in kennels in general, if an owner decides to object to what the police are saying, my dog isn't a pit bull, or my dog wasn't dangerously out of control. That's the main two reasons they'll object. And what tends to happen is, if they object, that automatically extends hugely the length of time that it takes for the case to be seen through the courts, because there'll be hearings, and they have to get a solicitor, they have to get an expert, you have to do a report, and so it's extended. And you became aware, slowly over time, that dogs where owners just capitulate and say, my dog is a pit bull. Okay, call it a pit bull, I don't care, just call it anything you like. I'll just agree, I just want my dog home. Those sort of cases will go through on the nod very quickly, as long as they are not, they don't have previous convictions, and they're sort of fit and proper people. They'll get their dog home really quickly. So that is the carrot that's dangled in front of people, if you like. But it's it's frequently that dogs are in kennels for a lot longer than 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. I mean, this dog that have written a report on that died in police kennels with this an obstruction. The dog had been in kennels for well, how long? Sorry, I can't remember, but it was sort of, you know, close to a year. And you sort of become aware that and of course it is, with all due respect to the police and everybody, it's in the prosecution if the police have decided to seize a dog and they are bringing a case to court, it is in their interest to make that dog appear dangerous. They don't deliberately go out to make it look dangerous, but they don't do anything to not make it look dangerous. So that if any sort of environmental enrichment, or if a dog looks afraid in kennels, they will keep it looking afraid. Nothing is done to intervene, and that is the concern. You know, but I know that this is not the general rule for all dogs, because I don't know. I can't go into the kennels where I only go into kennels if a dog can't be transported. So it's generally the dogs that are thought to be too dangerous to be transported that I can get into the kennels and I go and see a dog. Otherwise, dogs are brought to a mutually arranged location, you know, that is not, you know, can be disclosed, and it isn't anywhere to do with the kennels.
I find it well strange that, you know, you as a, you know, licensed veterinary surgeon and a, you know, established sort of professional witness, that they are worried that you might leak something, as opposed to somebody who's on minimum wage working in the kennels, who, you know, could easily be, you know, persuaded that, you know.
Well, you see, I mean, the thing is that there was an occasion where I accidentally, it's not that I'm deliberately leaking stuff. I mean, I don't need to talk about the case, but it was quite a high profile case. But I was meeting the police at a certain location in order to drive to the kennels. And what I said in my report, that the kennels were X number of minutes traveling time from this particular location where I met the police. I drove a certain amount of miles to the location of the kennels. Now, I was castigated for that because they thought that I could, by working out a kind of a circumference around the place where I'd met the police, the location I met the police, that they could somehow work out all the kennels that might be in that area, and they, you know, possibly the owners could pinpoint where the kennels were and organize some sort of, as I say, some sort of attack. But it is absolutely ludicrous, of course. I mean, just by.
But I mean, you know, any owner that arranges a raid on their kennels and their dogs are microchipped and whatever, I would have thought most of them would realize they're in, you know, they're in much bigger legal, what, you know, and the police get a much juicier conviction for somebody doing that than, you know, a poor dog that's.
Don't believe that microchips are keeping dogs safe at all. I mean, the microchip system is. I mean, the legal cases do just highlight how ineffective microchips can be. I mean, the police don't necessarily scan the dog at all, even if the dog's got a microchip there. Owners actually are very poor at generally moving, or certain owners, some owners, I'm not saying all owners, but some of the owners I've dealt with have been very bad, have omitted to say they've changed their, you know, changed house or whatever. I mean, one assessment I remember some years ago, I went, it was in the Metropolitan Police area, and as it happened, I mean, I was just, my scanner had run out of batteries, in fact, and so we were sort of guddling around, and the police chap said there, "Oh, I could lend you mine," the policeman. I could lend you my scanner, but we know that our scanners don't read all microchips. So you've got police who are actually scanning dogs to see if microchips are there, but they say, oh well, the scanner doesn't recognize them all, and it didn't seem to matter to them. I mean, it just becomes a bit, it's very wearing after a while.
So, I mean, and I'm conscious of time, and you said that you had limited time, but I want to sort of end on a bit of a positive. In relation to, what do you think the solutions are, both as far as Dangerous Dogs Act and teaching clients about interactions and avoiding conflict?
Well, I think ultimately it's got to start with educating children. I mean that is where, if we found that, whole sort of gamuts of society, whole sections of society did not know a certain thing. For example, if they didn't know that, I don't know, the sun was the center of the solar system and it mattered to their careers, we'd be teaching children. We'd be finding a way to teach children this rather important fact. But if we taught children, if this was all routine national curriculum education from primary school onwards, then all the children that are going to end up in these various walks of life are already predisposed to knowing this stuff. And of course, this will also bring in, welfare. You can teach them about welfare too. I mean, so I think it's got to start with children, but obviously that's not an immediate solution. I mean, I think what can happen, first of all, immediately, is that we ought to be getting rid of Section 1. I mean, the effort inquiry came down on the side of abolishing Section 1 of the Dangerous Dogs Act, because there's absolutely no evidence for the anatomy of the dog being correlating with any kind of aggressive tendencies whatsoever. That we've got to get rid of it, but there is not the political will. And then the problem with the pandemic is there's even less now. They've got so much else to think about. But you see, it seems to reflect to me. It reflects on society that we have this nonsense that will be looked on in the future as a sort of Neanderthal way of looking at having enshrined in legislation that a dog's got to be dangerous because of the length of its legs. I mean, it's just absolute utter nonsense.
But I mean, the other thing which, and I'd be interested to hear your view on this, is, when I was a kid and I used to play with the dogs, and and if I got bitten by a dog, my parents would quite rightly say to me, well, why were you playing with the dogs in that way? Or, you don't approach strange dogs. So at what point do you think we went from taking responsibility for our actions and our children's actions to suddenly piling everything onto the dog? I mean, was it the Dangerous Dogs Act but
well, I think to a large extent it was, because of the strict liability nature of Section 3. So Section 1 of the Dangerous Dogs Act, the about pit bulls being illegal, is reverse burden of proof. So that is, again, it's loaded against the defendant, because you've got to prove your dog is not a pit bull, rather than the police having to prove it is one. So Section 3 is because it's strict liability. So whatever the reason, whatever your dog did, whatever the child did, it can be used in mitigation, but it does not lead to an automatic defense. And what it's led to is there's been no onus on anybody to behave sensibly around dogs, because it's just that the law has come down to say that it doesn't matter what you did, it doesn't matter, the dog is always guilty. And so I can, to quite a large degree, blame the Dangerous Dogs Act for that, because it should have emphasised that it should, in parts of the legislation there should have been, to accompany it, some onus on people to be, if you behave in a certain way around dogs, they are likely to bite you. just like a horse is likely to kick you, or a car is likely to run you over. If you do these kind of things, you are likely to become injured, and there's got to be an aspect of common sense.
It's an interesting one, because the Animals Act, and I mentioned the legal cases I've been involved in with horses. And the way the Animals Act is worded, and it's obviously a much older piece of legislation than Dangerous Dogs Act, is if you know that your animal has the potential to cause harm by virtue of some characteristic, i.e. it's a big, horses are big and horses can hurt, then again, there is strict liability regardless. And one of the cases I was involved with, which actually resulted in a lot of people's insurance premiums going up, was a case called Murvahedi. And it was almost certain that somebody had tried to rustle these horses and broken down the fences, but the horses had ended up on a highway as a result.
Yeah.
And it ended up actually in the law lords, because and the law lords said, we fully appreciate this is not the intention of the law, but as it is worded, the owners are liable, because they accept that they've got horses and that horses can be dangerous, and they end up on the highway and they cause an accident. It doesn't matter that somebody broke down their very secure fencing, and released their horses. They have strict liability. And of course, horse owners.
I could never make sense of the Animals Act. I mean, it seemed to, what it gave on one hand, it seemed to take away with the other somehow.
Yeah. And it's, and that's unfortunately, that's not been modified to deal with that issue. But
you see, until there is proper investigation, there's got to be proper investigation of dog bite incidents. We have got to collect all dog bite incidents, from minor to major fatalities. And if that data is collected, and that is really what we've got to do, that there's got to be automatic reporting of these incidents, in order for them to be in an even-handed manner, not with the intention of prosecuting. I mean, our whole legal system is aimed at finding somebody to blame, not finding cause. And you see, and it's the same with road traffic accidents. I make the analogy a lot of the time, but unless you find the cause of the road accident, you can find somebody to blame and you can prosecute till you'll be blue in the face. But unless you find the cause, there will be no further forward to prevention.
Yeah, and then that's certainly the case. And remember a few years ago, and it was I think Sam Gaines at the RSPCA, in relation to fatal dog bite incident or dog related incidents, and she approached, I think, a number of us, and I certainly said, if the police are willing to keep it alive, I will do free of charge, an assessment, and take the samples, because it's only if we get the evidence will we actually know the reasons why a fatal incident has occurred. But there's just this rush to kill the dog, and there's very little you can learn. Well, you can't.
The dog is the major evidence, and it must be kept alive.
And again, it reminds me of something you say in the book, which I think is a really good point, is that the dog is the primary witness to the incident. And especially if it's a fatal attack, it is the only witness. So you're destroying evidence when you destroy the dog. Now, I'm not saying that these dogs should necessarily be kept long term or whatever, but if you want to develop sensible prevention programs, as you say, you've got to allow the development of that, people to gather the evidence. I have a colleague who works in forensic psychology, and he actually works with sex offenders. And I remember him saying to me, he said, we were talking about, the trying to gather the information. He said, well, in his line of work, it's really difficult, and people have a pretense of sometimes being scientific. And he said, what the best predictor of reoffending in sexual assaults is? I sort of said, no. And he said, well, it's the seriousness of the crime. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the most serious offenders don't repeat. I sort of looked and he said, because statistically they get banged up for life.
Yeah.
So if you just look at the core data and don't, going back to what we were saying right at the beginning, if you don't understand the context of what you're dealing with, you end up with this ridiculous conclusion that,
Yeah.
you know, and yeah, and it's that whole issue. Yeah, sorry.
But this is the most ludicrous replies I've had from people like George Eustace, who, you know, are in favour of keeping the Dangerous Dogs Act Section 1 is working. It's working, and it's working because he actually said that these dogs, if once released back onto the street under the conditions of the, you know, muzzled on lead, they don't reoffend. So that if you bang up innocent people in prison and then you release them, they don't reoffend. Yeah. Well, if they didn't offend in the first place, then it's hardly surprising that they, I mean, they just don't see it. And you really do wonder about the kind of cognitive abilities of those in government, really. But they can't detach themselves from their prejudices. They can't.
Well, it's a blind spot for them, isn't it? I think that's the problem with a lot of prejudices, is that it's this cognitive blind spot, and people just don't see it, and that's a big challenge, and that's, you know, our job as experts is to try and highlight this. But as you say, if you're up against a bench where their child was bitten by a dog 10 years ago, or they were bitten as a child, then it's going to be very difficult to convince them, isn't it?
You know, and I think you see, as an, you know, overview, if magistrates courts or wherever, if they start losing trust in the police, then they you know, the police have got to have people believe in them. Otherwise, where are they? And if you, but you see, I'm not. I mean, you know, we were great. You know, I would defend the police completely, but it's only when you get into this particular sort of niche, if you like, that I've been involved in, and you see the injustices and the concerns about welfare and all the rest of it, and you see the reasons why. I mean, quite a long time ago, Rod actually was wrongfully arrested. We could have taken it further, but anyway, it's another story, a long one. But through this case, he was arrested actually for being supposedly not paying a hotel bill in some place he's never been to before and never intends to go. I was supposed to have been his accomplice, so it must have entailed me being in Greece and in England at the same time and dyeing my hair. But despite that, they still said I could have been an accomplice. But anyway, and it turned out that I found out through the solicitor, the police station attendant solicitor, who was an ex-police officer. There's sort of three levels of these police forces in these counties. Particular counties were vying for position. And they had sort of a kind of table of success, and the levels of success were charges brought, arrests made. Second level was prosecutions brought, and third level was successful prosecutions. So at every level, they were successful at every level. So it's better to arrest somebody and it'd be a wrongful arrest, but you can still tick the box that they were arrested than not to have arrested at all. And it goes on. The prosecutions, that was good that we prosecuted. It doesn't matter we didn't succeed, but never mind, we just still tick the box. But you see,
it's this obsession with targets.
If there are police listening to this, they're probably going to, you know, well, I don't know what they're going to do, but they have got to also be free to say it as it is. That there are, you know, there are police officers who go into the police, who police dog handlers, who go in to do the further course they have to sit to become a DLO, a dog legislation officer. And they do it because they love dogs. And they find that when they go into it, that it sometimes means that they have a really lovely dog there, but it's got to be killed. And that is not why they became dog handlers. No. So I have every sympathy.
Yeah. Okay. I think we'll we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. It's been lovely to catch up with you.
Well, it's been great, and I'm so glad. I have to say, I was slightly hard to mouth for your opinion of the book, because I do rate your opinion. So I'm very pleased to hear that you think it's useful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as I said, I always enjoy reading your stuff, because it's easy to read compared to a lot of the stuff I have to trawl through. And you've always thought provoking and reflection, and that's the key thing. I think that is so important in this business, is that we mustn't stop thinking. As I said, I can recommend your stuff because, as I said, it is always so accessible as well. So thank you for that, because that is a real skill. And hopefully we'll catch up again before too long. So thanks again.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you so much.
Lovely to see you. Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye now. Kendall asked that this episode be dedicated to Victor Ambrose and Ryla Duffy. Victor Ambrose was an acclaimed illustrator and intuitive interpreter of many of Kendall's texts. Ryla Duffy was a traveller, horsewoman and communicator extraordinaire. She wishes to express her gratitude for both their insights and send condolences to their respective families. Thank you for listening.